I'm Craig Carroll, and I want to welcome you to our webcast focusing on creating space for race-based discussions in the workplace. I'm Craig Carroll, the Director for the Communications Institute at the Conference Board, and it'll be my pleasure to welcome our guests here for this conversation. During this conversation, we'll be addressing many of the critical issues of the day facing communication professionals in our organizations today when speaking out on the challenges surrounding race and the workplace. Some of the issues that we're going to be looking at today include how do we understand the workplace from the perspective of racial justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion? What are the challenges senior leaders face in creating an environment where managers and employees can have difficult conversations about race in the workplace? And third, what are the strategies, policies, and mindsets that senior leaders must adopt if we're going to get to the other side? And then fourth, how do we keep the momentum going long after public attention moves on to the next public issue, right? So we're going to look at these four issues, and then we're going to open it up for questions. And before we get started, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our guests. Okay. First, I'd like to introduce our guest for the webcast. Dr. Laura Morgan Roberts is a professor of practice at the Darden School of Business at the University of Virginia. Laura?
Hello.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Craig.
Yeah. And then we have Dr. Courtney McClooney, who is an assistant professor at Cornell University in the ILR School. Courtney, hello. Thanks for joining us.
Hi. Thanks for having me, Craig. So happy to be here.
Great to have you. And finally, we have Dr. Martin Davidson, who is the Johnson and Higgins Professor of Business Administration at the Darden School of Business, and also serving as the Chief Diversity Officer for the Darden School. Martin, thank you for joining us.
Great to be here. Thanks, Greg.
Okay, and we have a little bit more business here to cover here for those who are interested in CEU and CPE credits. So to begin with, somehow that is missing on here. Okay, thank you for, so just note that we have CEU credits available for the program. If you'd like to receive credits, please note that you have to stay online for the entirety of the live broadcast. You'll need to place your name, your email address, and the credit types needed in the designated box below. And then if you'd like to receive CPE credits, please make sure to click on the three pop-ups that appear on the screen throughout the program. Okay, now with that said, let's begin our discussion here. And before we begin the poll, if we could share the video. So I'm sharing a video here. This video is, it looks like it's freezing up, but let's keep it on pause. This is Charlene Wheelis, who is the, we can reset the video here for a second. Thank you. This is Charlene Wheelis. She is the former corporate vice president for Bechtel Corporation, the incoming chair for the Arthur Page Society, and she produced this video that was on YouTube that I found on LinkedIn, and for me it was a major turning point in the discussion.
As a communications leader, if you haven't already reached out to your leadership and spoken with them about the need to put out a message of compassion and concern about the divisiveness around us, I implore you to do so. This is a very human moment, and I believe that your employees are scared, regardless of their ethnicity or gender. People need to hear from their leadership that what is happening now matters. This is about a group of people being made to feel every day that their life is not as important or valued as someone whose skin color is different from theirs, lighter than theirs, whiter than theirs. I don't know if you can imagine what it feels like to wake up every day, know that you have done most everything you can to be viewed as equal, while deep down inside knowing that you are going to encounter people who will never see you as equal. For the most part, I have had a great life that I've worked hard for. But a day doesn't go by that I don't worry about finding myself in a situation where the person I encounter doesn't see an educated, professional woman in front of them, but rather just another black face whose life isn't all that important. And I'm confident that my black and brown brothers feel this tenfold. For many people, George Floyd was the tipping point, but he wasn't for me. It was Amy Cooper. To see and realize the confidence that she had that by openly lying would guarantee her protection and would guarantee Christian Cooper anything but safety. I watched that video and started to shake my head, and then I started to cry. That's the world we live in now. Right now, this is an important opportunity for CCOs to lead, for your coworkers to lead, and a time that CEOs must lead. People are scared. I'm scared. When people are this frightened, bringing their authentic self to work, being productive, and pretending like everything is okay are the last things on their minds. When you look like me and my brown and black brothers and sisters, the only thing on your mind is, will you be allowed to live? When you walk out the door each day, will you return? And will you be the same as when you left? That is the burden that we carry every day. Please do.
So is the video finished? I'm getting a little, great. Okay, super. We're getting a little delay here where I am. So we're just going to open up for discussion here. I just want to say that this video was the turning point for me after seeing the video from someone that I know, that I admire and respect, to hear her firsthand experience, that it was time to speak up. So for me, that was the issue for launching this webcast. So what I'd like to do is to organize our discussion around three themes. First, what are the central issues that we need to face right now? And then two, how do we get to the other side? And then three, how do we keep the conversation going long after this moment has passed in terms of public attention? And Laura, I will open the discussion up for you.
Thank you, Craig. That video is very moving, and I am moved in a way that I have been moved in the past month by the deeply personal accounts and appeals from people in leadership positions who, until this moment, conducted a calculus around whether or not they should speak out and name their own experiences and their own hurt and their own pain about racism and its impacts on them. And oftentimes they have navigated their careers by remaining silent about those personal, deeply personal aspects of their experiences. So we're now in a moment where there's an opening up, where people are sharing, people in positions of power are sharing their long-standing experiences, feelings, and pain on the one hand. And on the other hand, we also have leaders who are opening up about their long-standing naivete, either by choice or by default. So I think what's next for us is to start to unpack this silence. We can't really develop an effective communication strategy in this moment until we confront what was underneath the long-standing silence and the whispers in safe spaces and corners, by some, and just sort of the inattention or the feeling that it was irrelevant or unnecessary to understand or to tune in to these conversations, on the part of others. Now is a moment where we come together, and the only way that we can do that is through this honest and candid conversation.
Courtney, your thoughts here?
Yes, always so moved by Laura's words on top of the video that you shared, Craig, so thank you for sharing that. I think in this moment, some of the challenges that I'm noticing around communication is there's a sense of urgency. We're in a reaction mode, to something that has happened that has caused public outcry for Black Lives Matter and for racial justice and equity. And whenever people are in reactive mode, they tend to, from the physiological state all the way to organizational systems, be quite constricted and narrow in their purview. So it's a very narrowing of what's important. We need to do something now, and we need to handle this right now without taking a step back and pausing and developing a really cohesive and comprehensive strategy around not only what we say, but what it is that we're doing inside of organizations. But in stressful reactions, the veins constrict, and we're seeing that happening in organizations as well. They are being quite limited in the words that they're using, not having a clear understanding of how they can build action around those words or even have ongoing dialogue, let alone making one statement. So my hope is that as people become aware of their reaction mode, that they can somehow move out of this constrictive, restrictive mindset and have a more broad, open approach to what is happening right now. And like Laura said, it's not new, so we don't have to necessarily start from scratch when thinking about how do we respond in this moment, but instead see it as part of a larger systemic issue that has been going on for quite some time and will take a lot of time to resolve and can't be resolved in this urgent moment.
Right. So there's several issues that are going on here. One is whether or not companies speak out at all. That's one question that immediately began after the incidents occurred. And second, how to have those conversations internally. And then third, I would say, how do organizations handle the alignment or the coordination between the experiences inside their organization with what they're saying outside the organization? Martin, what are your thoughts on the points brought up to this point?
Well, Craig, I was just listening to my colleagues and friends, Courtney and Laura, and please remind me the name of the
Charlene Wheelis from the Arthur Page Society.
Charlene Wheelis. And I was just capturing the thread of fear and anxiety that we're talking about. This whole idea that what is the constriction, it's the silencing, it's Charlene talks specifically about the fear. This is to me, in the work that I've been doing on, this is a fundamental barrier to the actual communication. It's the fear and anxiety that, twofold, that I'll say something and it will be the wrong thing, and that the consequences of saying that will be deeply negative. And I think that those consequences aren't just about, hey, if I say the wrong thing, I might get fired, I might get punished. I think it's actually more fundamental. I think there's something around being able to say the right thing and feel as though I'm a good person. I'm fundamentally a just and moral person. And if I say the wrong thing, then that actually indicts me as perhaps a bad person. I think that's particularly a dynamic for majority around race when we're talking about majority and white colleagues, is that there's a sense of I'm walking on eggshells because I don't know what to say or how to say it, and the cost of.
I'm going to add another.
So I think
I'm going to add another layer into this. If we could ask the poll question and bring the poll question before the audience here, this will give the audience a chance to participate here, because this really shows how this is much more difficult here. So our question is that we want to ask the audience is that when your company considers taking a public stance, okay, is your leadership generally eager to advocate on issues we think are important, even though it might court division in your audiences? Second, is your organization reluctant to advocate in most instances, but as a policy you work to avoid your constituents? Or three, is your organization unwilling to advocate ever, or unless directly forced to? Or fourth, would never take a stand at all? If we could get the audience to participate here and share where your organization falls on this. Now, already, as I see the results start to come in, this is a major shift as opposed to where we were 2 years ago, where the second group of reluctance was the primary one to come in. and the results are still coming in. We'll keep the conversation going while we're looking at this. So one of the aspects here is that as organizations are speaking out, it's a question of whether or not their words match their practice, whether or not it matches the lived experience inside their organizations. That would be another area. Laura, would you like to step in here from what you see?
Well, I think these poll results are very interesting. So I'll start there to see that close to 60% of the people who voted just now, which is like over 400 people, said that they experienced their company as eager to advocate on issues, even though it may court division in our audiences. I think this gets at the core of what we were talking about in terms of that anxiety, the fear. You know, how are you going to go out on a limb, so to speak, in advocating for issues around equity and justice? And why are conversations about race fundamentally divisive? Right? So I think that's what underlies for me part of the question number one and number two. The options number one and number two is like this trade-off that, if we didn't name race here, we said more broadly taking a public stand. It doesn't have to be about race. It could be about the environment. It could be about, you know, lots of different, it could have been about COVID strategy or tactic, right? I mean, lots of different issues that we've been dealing with right now. But as I think about this in the context of where we've opened up today, I do think about the element of race in conversations about race that do like hit at the core of fear, anxiety, and the identity threat that my friends Courtney and Martin were naming, that just makes leaders feel that they can't speak out on race without alienating certain constituencies. And I think that tells us a lot about race itself and how race operates and functions within our workplaces and within our societies. Because some conversations that are related to race, you know, but they should be no-brainers in the sense that you want to create safe spaces where people of all backgrounds feel that they can thrive, they can flourish, they can contribute maximally from a position of strength, you know, where people feel supported and inspired by their leaders. That vision should not be a fundamentally divisive vision. Right. But when the word race is introduced into that framework, it all of a sudden becomes something else. It's not just a conversation about that vision and the unity, but it's having to confront these issues of equity and inequity. And that's when we talk about how some audiences or some stakeholders or constituents may feel that their needs are being served, but others may feel that their needs are being sacrificed in favor of supporting Black and brown workers and communities.
Do you see any progress here or any evidence of a turning point or a tipping point in the past 2 or 3 weeks or anything, any signs of progress or hope in the past month?
Well, I mean,
please do, Morgan.
Can I pick up on that? I just wanted, because I wanted to also react to the poll too, because to your question, Craig, the reason this poll looks like this, and I would predict that in a year it'll look like what you saw earlier, which is 35% again, is that over the last couple of weeks, I was talking with a colleague about this, and I was also reflecting on my own experience as a Black man in a predominantly white institution, which is that there's a certain wind at our backs right now. The protests and the openness and the permission to talk about race and to struggle with the challenges of it, I think are creating an environment which I find hopeful and an opportunity, which is we're able to sort of open and put some things on the table. Okay. I don't think we're particularly skilled at it. I think how we communicate, what we say, I think we're no better at that than we were before. But at least we have sort of a little bit of social permission to begin to put that out there. And I think that's really encouraging. And I think, I don't know, one of my interpretations of our audience's response to the poll is that that your organizations may in fact be eager or at least you feel that they're eager.
Okay.
And both of those are potentially good things.
Okay, so here's the question that came in from our audience. Why are conversations about race termed political when they are about equality or fundamental human rights? And the person also asked, I'd like to learn how organizations are addressing hate speech and racist attitudes and expressions in the workplace, and how can organizations address this and take disciplinary measures? I know that's a mouthful there. So we'll start off with why are conversations about race termed political instead of about equality or human rights? Courtney, do you have any thoughts here?
I have a few. I think that organizations, and Laura can definitely speak to this more, but a lot of organizations, especially in the U.S., don't want to talk about the ugly history of how they were able to garner so much wealth in the first place, and that was exploiting the bodies of enslaved Black people, really helped to generate wealth in this country. And organizations, in their hopes of we're making this product for a better society, no one wants to talk about that like shared history of how wealth was actually created in this country. And how it has always been fundamentally about creating races so that we can have inequalities associated with power and resources. But Laura can speak more about that, so I will leave that one just out there for her. In terms of how companies may or may not be addressing hate speech and racist attitudes, one of the things that makes me think of, I recently finished with a book chapter with the new president of Simmons University, Lynn Wooten, and the new dean of the Wharton School of Business, Erica Hayes-James, where we looked at what happened at the University of Missouri, that are known as Mizzou, in 2014 to 2016, and they had multiple explicit forms of racist events happening on and around their campus. It was sparked by students wanting to protest Michael Brown's shooting death from police officer Darren Wilson in Ferguson, Missouri, and what happened was a breakdown in communication, especially from the university, and their inability to respond effectively to what were some egregious forms of racism that was happening on and near the campus. So I think organizations, well, the way that we framed it is that they lack a lot of resilience. It's really hard for them to develop institutional knowledge and practices from racist events as they occur over and over, which speaks to Martin's point as well, that next year we might see a shift. I was also in Charlottesville in 2017 when white supremacists marched through the town and led to violence on the next day and the murder of Heather Heyer. And what happened in that first year was immense response and wanting so many workshops and dialogues and conversations about race, and the following year, all of that went away. It literally was the impression that as long as things aren't happening, we can go back to the status quo. But as soon as something happens, there's immediate response, immediate, task force, communication, but there's no strategy, there's no learning that's coming from this so that we can do better next time. And part of resilience is not just recovering to return back to the status quo, but actually adapting and developing a stronger system and institution to respond more effectively, knowing that we're living in a society where these things are going to continue to happen until we make fundamental structural changes. So I'll leave it there and invite more conversation around that.
Well, let's keep going. How do we get there, right? What are some of the actions and strategies and policies that we can create to get from here to there?
Well, I mean, I want to give the floor to Laura here in a minute, and we'll go back and forth on this. But here's what I want to set a tone on, because we were on a panel together whenever. Right? We've been on this for the last couple of weeks. But I think the context that we're talking about here in terms of action moving forward is that there really is a window of opportunity. And I think this is really, really important to attend to, because as Courtney said, I think when we were here, when in response to the 2017 Unite the Right rally, I agree with you. A year later, it sort of shut down. But actually, about 3 months later, I had colleagues here saying, we don't need to talk about this anymore. That happened in August. It's October. It's over. And so I think for me, I anticipate having seen these kinds of opportunities for civil unrest over my lifetime. This is the sixth or seventh one because they happen about every decade. Is that there's a window here, and it's going to close. And there will be a point where we'll say, man, that was something that happened in 2020. Now let's just get on back to life, and then let's not talk about these unpleasant things. So the context that I'll set, and we'll talk more about what we can do, is that the time to act is now. The time to communicate is now. The time to sort of create opportunities for change is now, because that window will close.
Okay.
Now, what do we do?
Right. Laura?
Yeah, I think also sort of adding to this question, so we've got a window here. We know that it's time sensitive. History has taught us that. And so the question, how do organizations address this and take disciplinary measures, I also think of in terms of the broader project of how do we put in place the infrastructure that will help to counteract what is a metaphorical undertow that, you know, the backlash is more too, it's almost too like the act of a metaphor, but for many people it's just that undertow or the backsliding. I mean, we're in high tide now. The waves are coming in. They're crashing at our feet. For some people, it's an awakening, right? So it's like, oh, this is so nice. It's so refreshing. For some people, it's really harsh. So this moment is a reckoning. It's a reckoning. There are many leaders that are being called to account for the choices and the decisions that they have made consciously and unconsciously over the past several years. But after that happens, then, you know, when I was a kid and I would go to the beach, Highland Beach in the summer, which is actually in the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland, which was one of the oldest Black-owned beach communities, because Black families who could go to the beach in the summer were not allowed to go to a lot of the integrated beaches. So my family had a home in Highland Beach, which is where Frederick Douglass's family also had a home.
Okay.
So there's
a lot of discussion about sorry for the overlap there. We had a little bit of a delay there.
Right. Right. So let me finish the point. So what I'm saying here is that there is a backlash. There will be a pulling back to the tension. And to answer your question specifically, what do we do to move the needle forward? We've already done it. So I can give you an example from Highland Beach, where there were vibrant Black professional communities. I can talk about what happens in the 80s and the 90s. So a lot of the initiatives that we put in place that help our organizations to advance in the past, those are some of the same things we need to. In the chat box, people have brought up affirmative action a few times and saying, why is it politicized? Because people tend to think of affirmative action. That's not a fantasy. That was what organizations and society did to remedy and to counteract some of the race-based discrimination. So I don't want to be silent about that part of the history in this whole conversation as well.
Okay. How do you view the strategy of companies who say we care about diversity versus actually coming out and saying hashtag Black Lives Matter?
I think this builds great off of Laura's last point about affirmative action, where we went from affirmative action as a mandate to do it if it feels right, to we care about meritocracy, and diversity and inclusion moved from enforcing a legislative law to making sure everyone feels good at work. It's about belonging now, not about dismantling structural systems of oppression that create underrepresentation of certain groups over and over and over again. Instead, it's like, do we feel like we belong here? Are we happy? And looking for feelings as a feel-good thermometer of how well we're doing on diversity, equity, and inclusion has really moved us away from doing the initial work of having D&I. And that's also why those departments have been gutted. How many resources do you need to make sure someone feels happy at work? Probably not that much. You need an ice cream social once in a while and you're good. But if the actual approach for chief diversity officers was to create systemic resources to counteract systemic racism, like Laura was saying, then you need way more resources to do that. Every department in an organization, including communications, should have a designated DEI official. I know whenever there's a high-profile discrimination event, the first person that the communication team calls legal or PR. How can we spin this story to make sure our reputation stays intact? Why are they not calling the chief diversity officer or DEI officials? Why is that not like the go-to practice or strategy?
Okay, that's a great question. So one of our audience members asks, they say that they don't actually have a paid diversity and inclusion employee in their organization. It's a nonprofit organization. And they're saying that everything that happens within the organization is a result of voluntary race equity committees. And they said many of them feel like they're extremely burned out. doing their jobs and trying to hold the organization responsible for adequate responses for the changes and policy changes that need to occur. But so what suggestions would you have for employees in a situation where they are being asked to take on the brunt of the work if anything's going to take place?
Martin?
Well, so I always have an action. I'm always mindful too of my implicit sort of privilege in my institution and so on, and that ranges all the way from sort of my level and all the way to my age and my gender and all these other places where I actually have privilege. And so I'm always thinking about a question like that. Here's the analysis, and then what we need to do about it, which is companies consistently exploit people of color and Black people, women, anyone whose experience, whose capacity to survive and thrive requires that the organization change. Companies exploit those people and ask them to fix the problem. They pull them out of their positions. They pull them out of their real work. They put them on diversity committees. They put them off track, make them chief diversity officers, and continually say, fix this, when in fact the capacity to actually do that is all but impossible.
Mm-hmm.
And so it creates this sort of setup. So the question is, what do you do when you are asked and when you are pulled in that position? And one of the things that I'm always advising, sort of, in fact, as recently as 2 days ago, advising especially young people to do, is to resist the invitation.
keep going there. I think you need to add a little bit more to that, Martin.
The reason I say that is because in the moment it's incredibly difficult, because what you're in an organization, and just like the institution you're talking about, Craig, in the question, it's like, if I don't do it, who's going to do it?
Right.
There's a discipline involved in this change that requires the capacity to see clearly what the cause and effect is of what's going on. And the more we keep stepping in and doing stuff, the more we continue to perpetuate a system of inequality by saying, we'll patch it up, it'll be okay. I actually think, and people may disagree with me, but I actually think it's really critical in the midst of this to say, no, I won't step in that committee. I won't do that, because you won't appreciate as an organization what's really going on. You won't undertake the real analysis until you're clear on the actual consequences.
And that's your what needs to happen now. I mean, if that's the case where no one's taking action, what types of metrics, what types of actions or milestones could be put in place, right, to hold an organization accountable when they've made some type of public statement in the past about what they're going to do in this area?
I mean, here's my observation, having done this and worked with companies for many years, is that what's that phrase? Leadership abhors a vacuum. And so part of what happens is when those kinds of commitments are made, when sort of there is skin in the game, when there are external forces such as societal, governmental, regulatory forces, suddenly companies learn to act. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a lever that needs to be pulled more and more. And let me say that in a hopeful way as well, because here's the other observation that I continue to have, which is that when companies and leaders are put in the position where they do have to be accountable, they're not as dumb and as inactive as they appear to be. The capacity to begin to figure out what to do suddenly emerges. And I think that that's a force that needs to be tapped more in the midst of this. Accountability, the research tells us that accountability is so critical in any kind of change here. This is just another element of that accountability.
Yeah. So one of the issues with companies speaking out now, and why this is so important, is that many have said that this is a way of being a proof test with their employees, right? That they don't believe them when they hear it internally until they see them speak out publicly, right? That offering those statements outside to the rest of the world guarantees to the employees, right, that they're going to be held accountable, right, that because the boundaries between internal and external are no longer there. So we can think about policies. We can also think about stances and communication to external. But how do we help the actual mid-level manager for having those conversations, right? Martin, earlier you mentioned the awkwardness there, and part of it being the idea that people think that they're good people, right? And that's what they're confronting, is that it's not really about that, right? It's not really about being a good person, but it's about the journey. Is that how you would put it, or?
I mean, yes. That for me, that's what I would say. And then my short answer, and invite my colleagues too, is that now we're getting to the point, the actual point, where part of what people need, and I saw this, I'm scanning the chat as well. People need tools. Okay. So we have an analysis, we have a sense of what's going on. Now, part of what that middle manager, that regular organizational person needs is a skill set, a competency set. They need tools to help them learn how to engage in the conversation. They need tools to help them understand, you know, what it is, what the nature of the dynamics and the experience and the reality and the history is. They need tools for resilience, because I guarantee you, every single one of us is going to mess up. We're going to make a mistake.
Yeah.
And what we don't want is to fall into that trap of, I'm a bad person. It's like, you know, stop it. Don't, let that go. Part of what it's going to be is, I've made a mistake. Now I'll recover from the mistake. Let's keep moving.
Yeah. So there's some research out of Copenhagen Business School on this whole question of hypocrisy in organizations. And one of the points that they made was that when we zap companies for speaking out or making a misstep or not living up to what their aspirations are, they stop talking about it, right? And the challenge there, the trouble is, the moment we stop talking about something is the moment we take social change off of the table. So how can we have a conversation knowing that there's going to be moments of perceptions of hypocrisy, or there's going to be missteps or bumblings? How can we keep all parties at the table and not running for the door to work through those difficult conversations and work to get to the other side, rather than running with the wind and going the other direction? Courtney, do you have any thoughts here?
Sure. I think, and this came up in the chat actually, that people had mentioned the need for psychological safety and having workplaces where making mistakes are normalized. I think too that when it comes to how companies might make sure that the conversation is sustained and ongoing, it's almost like with anything else that you're doing inside of a company. Before you launch a new product, you do product testing. Yeah. You ask people, like, what do you think about this? And you make changes based on the reaction, and you do more experimentation. And that's what I would like to see more of in companies, is experimenting with, let's try this approach, let's try this strategy, let's try to change this conversation of how we talk about these things, and measure what the change has been from this experimental practice. Like Martin said, the stakes are much higher, right? We don't want you to experiment with communities of color and figure out if we give them resources or not, will they live? Like, don't do that kind of experiment. Right. But when it comes to communication strategy, I do think there needs to be more experimentation that's only possible if psychological safety is in place. Laura, what do you think about that? Like, do you think there's something more beyond psych safety, or?
Well, I think psych safety and agility go hand in hand. So the psych safety is the trust that we are all committed to learning from failure, and that if I get it wrong, I won't be punished or penalized, in a way that could end in the workplace, that could end my livelihood. In the broader society, when we're talking about safety, it's like, if I get it wrong, it might end my life. But here, at the very least, we're talking about the deleterious effect on my livelihood. So I need to feel like I have some sort of buffer to be able to, amble through these conversations, and for them to be a little bit awkward, but we're all committed to a norm of, positive intent and learning from failures when they occur. The agility component comes, again, with this experimenting. If that didn't work, we're actively seeking feedback. We can acknowledge it didn't work. Let's try something else. So you had a fireside chat, or let's start with a statement. You sent out a statement. You got some feedback that the statement didn't resonate, or people felt that you missed some things in your initial statement. So then you circle back and you do, you know, you listen, and then you come out with your next version of your statement. It doesn't have to be a one and done. You have multiple opportunities to communicate. That should be ongoing. As long as you're communicating, look, I heard you, this is what I learned, this is what we learned, I'm reiterating my commitment, and you know, let's keep the channels open so we can keep moving forward. Leaders model that. When the senior executives can model those behaviors, I think the middle managers can then feel a bit safer and more protected in trying to engage in those kinds of learning behaviors as well.
Okay. So one of the questions that came up, yeah, Martin, please.
I was just going to close the loop on that too, because I think Mike is absolutely 1,000% right, and I also think that the psychological safety, the sense of psychological safety, is like a muscle that gets developed, and the more you have those kinds of experiences and leadership modeling and opportunities to make a mistake and recover, the less less fragile you become. Right? And so what I need for psychological safety, it doesn't take so many bells and whistles. I feel safe because I've gotten practice at doing it. That's really important, this dynamic process in place.
I appreciate you using the analogy of the muscle, right, as opposed to just building skills, right, and that we can't get to the finish line in one step, right, that you can't lift 60 pounds before 40 and 200 pounds before 100, right? You have to start somewhere and keep making progress. So I think that's an understated metaphor of thinking about the role of muscle building in this moment. So here's the question that came up earlier tied to the difference between not being racist and being an anti-racist. Can you comment on the implications of this this distinction for healthy race-based discussions in organizations?
Laura has a lovely Bloomberg piece that just came out talking about anti-racism, so unless she wants me to read it, I think she should just answer it.
I was going to say Courtney has a lot to say about this.
Yep.
So when I think about the not being racist stance, I think that ties back to two things. One is a collective assumption of neutrality. Like there's this point of neutrality where we don't see race, we don't think in terms of race, we're colorblind, we're difference blind, and therefore if we can hold that stance, that myth of, you know, being neutral and detached from it, then we can say, I didn't do anything wrong, you know, hands off. So that's the I'm not racist, like I'm not involved in that, I don't have any parts of that kind of stance. But then that's collective, right? But then on the individual level, that, well, I'm not racist is tying back to part of what Martin and Courtney were talking about earlier, the I'm a good person, you know, I'm fighting against my fear or anxiety that my identity is being threatened. So my attention and my energy is focused on proving how good I am and affirming myself. When you're anti-racist, your attention and energy is toward having compassion for those who have suffered at the hands of racism, and it also is turned toward dismantling the systems that are in place that continue to perpetuate the vast inequality and injustice. So to take an anti-racist stance is to take a moral stance. It's not an instrumental stance. It's not a business case for diversity, which I think is what Courtney was referencing in the Bloomberg piece. It's not saying, okay, you know, we'll do diversity because it's a smart thing to do. You know, it's going to benefit us economically in all of these different ways, so we'll focus on it. You know, you come at a place of anti-racism, you say, look, I recognize there's some trade-offs. I'm going to alienate some of my base, but because of my moral conviction and my courage, I'm going to take a stand anyway and speak out in that platform.
Okay. Now, Laura, you had another piece that I thought was pretty interesting, where you shared your response to some of the, I wouldn't call it backlash, but an alternative voice that was saying, well, it's not that Black Lives Matter, it's that all lives matter. And I thought you had a very good story there that would be very helpful for this audience here. Could you share that with us?
Oh, I'll give the short version of that story. So that's another childhood story that has some lessons about equity for me in this whole trajectory. So I talked about going on road trips for summer vacation, driving cross country with my parents and two sisters. And so we all wanted to get to the same place. We're all tired of being in the car. It's a long road trip, 20 hours. Everybody wants to get there. Everybody wants to have fun once we get there. But one kid in the car has to use the bathroom. That person has a greater sense of discomfort along the ride and a deeper sense of urgency around getting there. So you can say we're all on the same journey, and that is true. Yes, all lives matter. And also hold within that the truth that there are certain individuals, Black people, who have a deeper sense of discomfort and therefore even a greater sense of urgency and intensity in this moment to try to advance this agenda toward equity and justice.
You know, when we pull off on the at the stop for the restroom break on the way of this long journey, we might find that actually more people need to go too, right?
That's right. That's right.
While we're there. Yeah. Okay. So one of the questions. Yeah, Martin, please.
I was going to say the one quick thing I would add about this too is that the Black Lives All Lives thing. We were talking a bit earlier about tools and about competency. And one of the tools that I think is important for people to begin to embrace, and in some sense it may sound self-evident, but it's really critical around this, is this fall back to duality. It's either this or it's that. Mm-hmm. And under threat, which so frequently happens in fear and anxiety connected with issues of race and diversity, we fall into either or. And if you weren't sitting in that, you don't have to be sort of a brilliant PhD to realize that, oh, wait a minute, if they say Black Lives Matter, that doesn't mean that all lives don't matter. It just means that I'm making a statement. That's not a complicated concept, but it feels complicated because we're stuck in the threat. There's skill in being able to take a breath in conversations around race and engagements around race, to slow it down and to let yourself, let your physiology and your mind recover to their normal abilities. And I think that's
I was just about to comment on that, yes.
Yeah, classic example.
Courtney, why don't you pick up with that thing?
I love it because it's that, absolutely, it's that restriction of the veins. And I think Madupe Akinola at Columbia University would be so proud of me for remembering the physiology of the body. It's when we restrict our veins physiologically, we're short of breath, we're narrow tunnel focused, it's survival mode. And if I'm saying Black Lives Matter, does that mean that mine all of a sudden doesn't? That fear, that anxiety attached to it. But when you can, like Martin said, literally take a breath, it broadens your purview to know that it is not this either or duality statement, which is also how we keep systemic inequality in place, by making everyone assume that the other person's out to get me and I have to protect my own and not advocate for this other group that may not look like me or who experiences me.
Yeah, and from an identity standpoint, this is one piece where communication is really important, because the communication can either, make more salient these polarities, the us versus them, or, by turn really talk about how it's a win-win for everybody, like the rising tide lifts all boats. Because when we are threatened from an identity standpoint, we're trying to stabilize our sense of self. And our default tactic for doing that is to make social comparisons. We'll look around and compare ourselves to other people and say, well, I'm better off than this person. Well, I'm more deserving than that person. Because that is how we have been taught, or conditioned, I should say, to center ourselves from an identity standpoint. So one of the things that Courtney Martin and I do is to try to engage some strength-based perspectives for resourcing that give us alternate pathways so that we can feel more stable and secure, physiologically and psychologically, and then we're better able to identify and frame these win-win scenarios where race and other dimensions of difference are concerned.
Oh, great. So we have one more question, and then we'll turn it to final thoughts, where we think about, okay, what are some of the takeaways that chief communication officers or leaders of communications could have, whether they are also working with D&I or they're partnering with D&I, or maybe that role isn't there yet, and they are trying to establish some sense of clarity and direction and focus for the organizations. So here's the question. Aside from measuring demographics and looking at metrics tied to demographics, what are some of the things that we can do for measuring diverse engagement or inclusion or psychological safety?
Martin?
we've been thinking a lot about this here at Darden because we're looking at the metrics and the things that matter. And I will say two things. The larger piece is the kinds of metrics that are going to be valuable in your organization oftentimes are organization specific. And so it goes completely with the thread of our conversation, which is that the more we free up and get sort of clear conversation, the more we can be creative in coming up with the metrics that we need. But around inclusion, I was just in conversation actually with our dean, and we were talking about brainstorming. We were literally just brainstorming what kinds of metrics would be useful. And in addition to the kinds of survey types of metrics where you can get people's attitudes and impressions, you know, around their experience, belonging, and so on and so forth, there are also some, and above and beyond the other kinds of metrics that would be valuable, such as pay equity issues, you know, advancement data, and so on and so forth, which are always available as well. We were actually brainstorming on metrics around what it would take to bring people into the organization and how you source, where you find people. And in particular, we're talking about finding great Black professionals. And instead of going to the same places that everyone always goes to, creating a diversity of pipelines. How is it that you actually look in different places and you measure the diversity of your pipeline? How many different pipelines do we have? How many different sources? What is the quality of those sources? So just because I have one doesn't mean I'm using it. And so you can actually measure and track those things. And so, and for me, that's a simple example of something that is just the beginning of a creative idea about the kinds of things that you can do that will allow you to measure your progress.
Laura, Courtney, any thoughts here on metrics?
I thought Courtney's point earlier about the dedicated resources was a really important one, so I just want to amplify that again. That I think was part of your opening comments, but it's, you know, having a dedicated pool of resources, even in resource-constrained times, like the ones we're likely to face in the coming months of 2020 due to the pandemic, that are targeted toward, you know, getting the expertise and the leadership for advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, whether that's the strategic advising around your communications and other forms of messaging, if it's developing the customized leadership development resources and pathways that will help to advance and retain talented people of all racial backgrounds, but especially those who are underrepresented in your organization. You know, these things can't be done on the backs of volunteers, as you know, many of the commenters said today. We've got to prioritize it by allocating the resources necessary to make that happen. And then a third thing that I would add is collecting the data and making data transparent. So around this opening comment of silence, I think that's where we've also been silent. We collect a lot of these metrics and then we don't share them because they don't tell a favorable profile, then we're not able to act upon them.
Great.
So that's the other piece I would say.
Okay, that's good. So for our closing thoughts, I want each of you to focus on the question of what are the actionable steps that we can take today? What are our immediate next steps for any organization that is at this moment right now and looking overwhelmed, paralyzed with where to go? What are the first 2 to 3 things that they need to do to get started?
I think for our communication professionals, looking at how it is that you have created a discourse around the values of your organization. So if you value professionalism, for instance, what does that mean? What do all of these terms mean? Laura and I have been disentangling professionalism as being code for straight, able-bodied white male, which means that everyone else has to code switch to become that. If we value meritocracy, if we value excellence, like can any individual in your organization define what that means? And as communication directors, it's very important that you think about the words that you're using to describe and explain what it is that you all are doing and what your values are. And if those things default back to a status quo or a certain body or a certain person, then it is the responsibility to start interrogating the language and the discourse that has been set forth from your organization. So that would be my immediate next step.
I like the idea of introducing the idea of interrogation there. That's fantastic. That's good. Martin.
So what I would say is I'm an advocate of baby steps. of actionable things that you can actually do, and appreciating that if I imagine my vision, my fantasy of our audience is that it's an audience that has diverse skills, some of whom would be saying, yeah, I've never really paid close attention to this now, and now my feet are under the fire to actually do this. What do I do? Mm-hmm. What I would say is the two things that I would encourage are, one, go back and talk about and begin talking and engaging with your colleagues about what you're paying attention to and learning. Start by talking about a webinar that you saw and some of the ideas that stuck with you. Use that as a way of beginning to engage conversation. If silence is the enemy of advancement here, break the silence. Do it at the personal level. And the second thing that I would say, which I say not only to communications professionals but also marketing professionals, seek out feedback on your product. Okay, if there's communication that you want to get a diverse set of readers to give you some feedback on it. It's amazing what simple things that any of us are likely to miss because of our own unconscious biases, because of our own norms, because of our own habits. It's so easy just to get someone else to say, hey, can you get a second pair of eyes on this for me? Mm-hmm. Build a regular group, a group that you trust, confidence you trust, to support you in the communications and the output that you're creating. That's what I
Great. Okay. Laura, final words with you.
Yeah, so really quick then, I would say on top of all of that, clarify your why. Like you need a personal story for why you care about this issue today. If you're going to take any leadership, whether you're an entry-level person who feels like you need to speak out, speak up, or reach out and affirm somebody, if you're a middle manager and you need to lead your team through this space of deeper understanding, and if you're a senior level leader, each person needs a personal story that clarifies your own conviction in this space. So find your why, and that will give you the resilience that you need to keep moving forward and doing the work.
Oh, great answer. Well, thank you, everyone. Well, this concludes today's discussion. I'd like to thank Courtney and Laura and Martin here for joining us today. I'd also like to thank our audience for taking part in this conversation as well, and for all of your comments in the discussion box. If you've enjoyed today's program, we hope that you'll take a look at some of our other future webcasts that are coming up. You can see here a brief list of some of the upcoming complimentary programs that are made available to the public. Please download the slide deck from our download pod below and click on any of the links to register for any of the programs to review a complete list of our upcoming webcasts at conference-board.org/webcasts. We also have a fantastic series of podcast programming brought to you by the Conference Board Marketing and Communication Center, designed to help connect listeners to marketing and communication leaders who are ahead of the game. And so we ask you to check out our entire catalog of programming and podcasts at conference-board.org/podcast. And finally, please don't forget to fill out the program evaluation. The form will appear at the end of the screen of this program here. I would love to hear your thoughts on today's program, about the webcast, and how it can improve for future sessions that we have. Again, my name is Craig Carroll, the leader for the Center for Communications and Marketing's Communications Institute, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.